Okay, well, I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. I'm Roy Bingham. I'm with Michael Arrington. We've got Brendan Mitchell-Chewsborough in the background as well, who's going to help us with Q&A. First thing I want to say is that the deck that we're going to present today will be posted on BDSA.com. If you're concerned about taking notes and pictures of the deck, it's going to be posted, so you don't need to worry so much. You can listen to our dulcet tones more carefully instead. And then the other thing is questions and answers. There is a drop-down menu, and you can type in a question at any time while we present, and we're going to allocate a significant amount of time to addressing those questions at the end of our presentation. So thanks very much, and maybe we can move on to the first slide now, Michael. So you're going to hear a tiny bit about BDSA. Most of you are very familiar with us, so it'll be very, very brief. Then we're going to talk about the global legal cannabis market, starting off with the United States. Michael's going to bring us up to date on Canada and the trends in that country. And then we're going to look at the international markets with particular emphasis on the largest growth markets internationally. If we go to the next slide, most of you will know that the core of our business is around our retail sales tracking capability. We work with thousands of dispensaries who provide us all of their point of sale transactional data that we organize after cleansing it, of course, into a database, and it's then accessible through our Green Edge tool to our clients, which enables you to know which products are selling in what quantities and at what prices, both at the SKU level, at the brand level, at the brand house level, at the category and subcategory level, all the kind of levels that you need in order to be thinking about introducing new products or marketing and sales campaigns. Secondly, in response to requests from our clients, we do consumer insights, which essentially means we survey thousands of consumers semi-annually. We've been doing this now for 5.5 years, getting ready to do our 12th survey. And that provides tremendous longitudinal information on trends in consumer behaviors, what they consume, why they consume it, when they consume it, purchase habits, and all of the rest. Both as a snapshot and perhaps most importantly as a trend that is somewhat predictive of what's likely to happen in the future. Today, we're really focusing on our market forecasts capability, which, as I said, we developed initially back in 2016 in book form and then brought online. I'm pleased to say that Michael Arrington, who's with me, was back on that team back in 2016, and Brendan Mitchell-Chewsborough. So we've got a lot of longevity when it comes to studying the trends in the cannabis industry, a lot of experience from seeing one state after another, starting off back in 2015 for us with a close look at the Colorado market before we expanded to California, Oregon, and the other big Western states. And of course, we now track in retail sales tracking 14 states that represent 80% of the US market. So market forecasting, of course, one of the most challenging things because we're looking forwards, whereas most of our other work is about the recent past. And then menu analytics is an additional service that we launched only about 3 months ago that's showing great traction with our clients, and it gives you tremendous insight about the availability of products and brands at the store specific level and at the local and state level. Moving over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Roy. So let's talk a little bit about our legal cannabis forecast model. So our coverage is 55 U.S. markets, 13 provinces and territories in Canada, and 30 plus global markets. We look at the medical, adult use, and also the illicit channels in those markets, and we forecast in the U.S. and Canada product categories. In the U.S., that's 10 product categories. I think in Canada, it's 8. Our model also contains important demographics, population, legal adults, past month use, data, etc. Where does all this data come from? Well, we have a lot of quantitative sources. Some of them are our own retail sales tracking in 14 states, plus some unpublished markets where we see data. is very informative to our forecast. It's helped us from the early days model it to become what it is today. We also have in Canada partner tracking, retail sales tracking via Highfire, and then we have other government input, other data such as data from the government, patient registration, licensing of dispensaries, sales and taxes, etc. And then on the qualitative side, we do have our consumer insights data, as Roy mentioned, where we're asking people about their attitudes towards cannabis, usage, need states, preferences, etc. And then, of course, we keep an eye on regulatory. What's going on with legalization? What do new regulations look like? What will that mean for the market? Does this limitation change the way the market's going to grow? What about tax burden? What about illicit competition, etc.? So I'll go back to Roy to talk about the Global Cannabis Market Forecast.
Thank you, Michael. So as I explained earlier, we're going to do a breakdown from the USA and Canada to the global market, but here's the big picture first, which is 2022, we've got a market of $32 billion. We are projecting substantial growth in that market over the next 5 years to almost $60 billion. That's the 13% compound growth rate. As you can see, the United States, which we'll get into first, represents about 80% of the current total. It's going to still be about 75% of the total by the time we get to 2027. And as you can also see, the purple bit at the bottom, although it looks a bit blue on my screen right now, is the medical market, which we expect to be approximately flat, largely because of the conversion of states into adult use consumption. You can see the darker blue or black on the screen almost, which is a lot of growth in the US market. Immediately above it, you can see the Canadian adult use market, which is going to grow steadily, and Michael will explain that in more detail. International medical market, which is small but steadily growing over this time horizon. And then the big thing we'll talk about is an international adult use market that we expect to become material in 2024. So those are the components of growth, though of course we all know the United States is most important. And I do want to recognize that this is coming off a very tough year in the US market. Only 2.8% growth in 2022 on a national level, and that dreadful term negative growth in a number of markets that Michael will explain. I've always thought that term is very peculiar. I would have thought we would use the term contracted, reduced, declined, or decreased, but apparently negative growth is the way that we describe a shrinking market. So it was a very tough year for many major states, with significant growth, of course, in the newer markets that Michael will explain in more detail. As you can see, the top contributors to growth in our projection for the very first time include Germany, a country, as a leading contributor to growth. There is a very long tail here, as you can see. About 10 billion of that growth will be contributed by the states and countries outside the top 10. But we expect Germany, and there you can also see Mexico, to contribute very significantly. The new markets in the big states like New York and New Jersey, a major contribution to the total growth. And other big markets, of course, that are well established, like Florida with its medical market, that we expect in due course to become an adult and medical market in this time horizon. And the California market even contributing to the growth, even though it has had a tough time recently. And you can also see some other major states that are relatively newer to the picture, like Ohio, Missouri, contributing to that overall growth to the 60 billion, almost doubling from 32 billion in 2022. Now I'll turn it back to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Okay, so let's take a look at the U.S. cannabis market. In 2022, as Roy mentioned, we saw an actual, a very strong slowdown in growth to just 2.8%. but the total reached 26.1 billion that year, and we're forecasting pretty significant growth over the next several years to 44.5 billion in 2027. That's a CAGR of about 11.2% over that time. And it may seem counterintuitive as we're starting to see mature markets slow down, but we have a lot of activity going on that's going to cause some increase in the market. Next year, we're expecting to see stronger growth than we did this year, around 14%. That's because though mature markets are going to see, we expect a small decline in 2023, and we'll look at the details of those. We got 6 new adult use markets in 2022, 5 if you exclude New York, which was fairly minimal. And we've got 5 more opening in 2023. One of those has already begun sales, Missouri, and it's seen pretty successful growth so far. And we're forecasting 8 additional adult use openings between now and 2027. So if we look at the schedule of sort of these new market launches, we've highlighted some of them in bold so that you can kind of see the significant ones. New Jersey, New York last year, but Montana and New Mexico both launched with better than average adult use sales per adult pop in the state. Those states are surrounded by some non-medical, non-adult use markets in variation, and so of course that probably contributes to some additional sales. We have Missouri, which had a very successful medical launch a couple years ago, now launching adult use and seemingly rolling out pretty well. We may have in the next year Oklahoma and Maryland. Maryland approved its adult use program in the last election alongside Missouri, but though adult use cannabis is legal on July 1st, we don't necessarily expect regulations to be in place and for sales to begin. It's possible if regulators move quickly. Oklahoma is actually voting in a special election today to approve adult use regulations. If that passes and there are no legal challenges, we're expecting sales to begin next year and be fairly significant. We've seen Oklahoma medical sales take a little bit of a downturn prior to this. It's one of the first markets where we've ever seen that happen. But we expect adult use sales to be pretty strong there if and when they do launch. In Florida and Ohio, Pennsylvania, these are all fairly large medical markets that we expect to see adult use in the near future, a couple of years. And then following the election in November, we had some changes in leadership in a number of states, and there's more talk about moving to medical, moving to adult use. One of the significant ones is probably Minnesota adult use legislation, which appears to be gaining momentum. We don't currently model them as an adult use state. They were a very limited medical market, but liberalized considerably over the last year, where they added flower, and then later in the year, gummies and shoes. So we'll keep an eye on Minnesota. If we look at what happened in 2022, I've jumped to the next slide. This is the chart that kind of couches next growth over the next few years in an interesting way. What we've done is we've taken the pre-2020 adult use launch markets, and you can see them in that list down there: Alaska, California, Colorado, Massachusetts, Minnesota, or Michigan, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. All of those markets launched pre-2020. We can see that they had a pretty stellar year in 2021. We saw some pretty good growth during the during the restrictions of the pandemic. People were at home more, maybe they were using a little more. We saw flower take up a little bit, etc. Coming into 2022, we're coming off of that bump, and we think there's a pretty big correction. We've seen prices drop, across all markets, of course, but in the really mature markets, we've actually seen small amount of contraction. Those markets launched in 2020 and onward, and you can see the list down there. I won't go through the whole thing. Are going to be contributing significantly to growth through 2027. If we look at the comparison up in the upper right-hand corner there, you'll see that our pre-2020 markets are going to be growing at about 3.4% over that time, and our 2020 onward markets are going to be doing nearly 18%. Now, if we look at what happened in 2022 versus 2021 on the price and sales volume, you can take a look at this chart where each market that we track in retail sales tracking is the bubble indicates the size of the market. The coloration indicates its position in this previous chart here. So if you look, the lighter blue is pre-2020, the darker blue is 2020 onward. We've colored these the same way to just kind of show. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that these sort of mature markets, California being the latest to launch in January 2021, January 2018, excuse me. Massachusetts and Michigan both launched late 2018. Our mature markets have seen sort of, they're dropping prices, but not as fast as these newer markets where prices are still high and still have time to come down. And we saw a little bit of contraction in sales. So you can also see a couple of medical markets where sales actually contracted in advance of adult use. That's Pennsylvania and Maryland over here on the lower left. Arizona kind of right in the middle, it launched adult use in 2021. And then we have in this pre-2020 group, Massachusetts and Michigan, where we're still seeing prices come down, but sales continuing to grow. And then far off in the right-hand corner is Missouri. You'll note that that's a period only from 4/21 to 12/21, and so we've comped it to 4/22 to 12/22. That's just when our tracking goes. We don't have adult use in there at this point, right? So we're going to be seeing the dynamic of that changing next year. And if we look at more specifically the Northeast US, and you can see the list of states we're including down below, basically it's everything north and east of, I guess, Pennsylvania and Maryland. I probably got that a little wrong. I meant to include a map, but it didn't really fit. So if we take the total of those markets from 2022, when many of these markets are either have just launched adult use rather recently or will in the next couple of years, we see a total of 4.9 billion, which is about, got a number here, 19% of total US sales. By 2027, we expect those markets to have grown at a CAGR of about 20.7%. And they're going to account for about 28%, so almost a third of total US spending. And you'll note that that is faster than this, just the 2020 onward markets. This is just the Northeast. So while the West saw early cannabis market growth, we're expecting the East to take us through these next few years of strong growth. And, you know, later we'll probably see the South coming online as those guys move into medical and then transition into adult. So let's talk about the biggest market, the biggest single market in the world, which is Canada. Canada saw a decline, California. California saw a decline last year of about 8% to $5.2 billion. That's down from a peak of $5.7 billion in 2021. Average retail prices dropped pretty significantly and units didn't make it up in volume, so we saw a little bit of decline. California has a lot of issues, which many of you are probably aware of: high taxes, high operational costs, kind of a heavy bureaucracy, and also initially kind of limited enforcement on illicit operators. So, but over the past couple of years, state and local operators, regulators seem to have tried to take this situation under control. We've seen small amounts of tax relief. We've seen bureaucratic changes to lighten that load, and we've seen some increased enforcement on illicit. So we do think those are going to have a positive effect on the market, but it will take some time to have effect. So we're forecasting another decline this next year, much slower, and then very slow growth, 5% CAGR from 22 to 27 over the course of the next several years. California is, despite being the biggest market, a bit underserved. It doesn't have as many dispensaries as, for instance, Oklahoma, I think, has several times the number of dispensaries per cap as California. So we expect to see some more spreading of retail footprint. Again, some of those other changes we talked about, and a return to growth in California, but slow. And in Florida, another market we want to look at in some detail. Florida's got a robust medical-only market that's been in operation for a few years. And in the last year, we saw sorry, I've got my percentage covered up here, 27% growth in 2022 to $2.2 billion, and registered patients reached nearly 800,000. So just given current registered patient levels, Florida regulations allow for an additional 22 dispensaries to be open. Assuming patients keep growing, we'd expect more dispensaries to open. So we're expecting pretty good growth in Florida medical market over the next couple of years. About a 15% growth to 2.6 billion in 23, and an 8% growth to 2.8 billion in 2024. Right now, there is a ballot initiative gaining signatures in Florida. It looks likely to put it on the November 2024 ballot that would allow adult use, to allow existing medical dispensaries to begin selling adult use more or less immediately, would allow regulators to license additional adult use dispensaries if they so chose. And so the launch of that, we believe, first of all, we're assuming it'll pass, and second of all, that it'll roll out quickly, and we do believe that's the case. And if so, we'd expect first year sales to reach about 873 million and grow from there. Total Florida market reaching about 4.5 billion in 2027 after growing at a 15% rate from 22 to 27. Of course, the medical market will decline after adult use is launched, but we expect that decline to be perhaps more gentle just due to the demographic situation in Florida and the robustness of its existing medical program. Sorry, I needed a drink of water there. Let's move on to Canada, which I tried to jump into earlier. Canada's sales are strong, but slowing in adult use. Medical is beginning to decline. In adult use, we saw, looking at it on a quarterly basis, we saw the first couple of quarter-on-quarter declines in Canada this year, but strengthening up by the end of the year. We're expecting growth to continue there over time. In 2022, we look at cannabis products that were launched under Cannabis 2.0 a couple of years ago, and we see that the share is more or less stabilizing. We had at one point assumed that the share would get to something like what we see in the US, but obviously a little bit different. As it stands, major provinces see edible share in the 8 to 9% range. That's not so in Quebec, where edibles are more limited. There are a few things that we classify as edibles, but they are limited. Vapes reach 22% in Alberta and 17% in British Columbia and Ontario. Quebec doesn't allow them to be sold, so there's none there. And pre-rolls gained a massive share over that time, reaching the 20% in Quebec range, 28 to 35 in Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario. So we're seeing things stabilize. Pre-rolls very high compared to the US. In Ontario, over the past couple of years, we've seen a rapid dispensary rollout, which has gained that province considerable share. Share changes are stabilizing between provinces in the adult use space, but Ontario gained a little bit in 2022, and we expect it to gain some more in 2023. Quebec lost a little bit. So as medical sort of resumes a little bit of a decline after stability kind of during the COVID era, we're expecting to see that continue to decrease. But as you can see, it's a very small sliver of the overall market, adult use being the star of the show, and we're expecting that to grow at a CAGR of 6.3% over the next several years to in 2027 at 5.7 billion. And then moving on to international. Right now, international cannabis is largely either very sort of tight pharma, maybe a little bit of cannabis program, to transitioning to liberal, slightly more liberalized cannabis markets like we see in the US, although that transition has been slow and is still taking some time. In a couple of the largest markets, though, there's been some activity. Mexico, quite a while ago, approved some more formal, expanded medical regulations, and also approved adult use, although that has been delayed with various courts and legislative issues. While a June 21 Supreme Court decision opened the way for it, implementation of these regulations is still delayed. So we're currently forecasting sales there to begin mid-2024 and reach about 150 million that year. And then we've also got Germany, which is a country that's about twice the size of California. It's a fairly limited medical program at the moment, but has been talking very seriously about introducing adult use, and currently going through some negotiations with the EU to get approval there, which would make overall implementation easier. but it's not necessarily the case that if they didn't get approval that it wouldn't happen. So that's a wait and see, but currently we're forecasting it to be a pretty strong market, even if we do so conservatively by US standards, looking at adult use spending per adult pop. Total market forecast we're putting on their first year in 2024 at 1.3 billion. And the whole market, as medical liberalizes around the world and new markets open up, we see medical cannabis under discussion in places like Brazil and Japan, and also a handful of adult use markets that are either European markets that are experimenting with or are actually testing adult use. So we're seeing the market growing at a total of about 40% CAGR from 22 to 27 to 9.5 billion. And I'm going to turn it back over to Roy to wrap up.
Thanks very much, Michael. So obviously, it's very important where you are, and it's very important that you're there at the right time, as it were. I'm reminded of how CPG products on the whole, you know, if you have a 2 or 3% growth in real dollars, not necessarily in inflation adjusted, or in inflation adjusted, I should say, then you think that's okay, that's a decent year. If you have 6 or 7% growth, then there's tons of opportunity. Looking here at the charts, you know, we're seeing significant growth across the board, even at 5% in markets like California, which is a little encouraging compared to the recent past. So we do expect this acceleration in 2023 and beyond, driven by new openings, expansions of markets, and of course, good growth in Canada. And as Michael explained, some exciting opportunities overseas. Finally, I can recall going to London and other European countries back in 2018 and 19. And quite a bit of enthusiasm there, but not very much really happened for a very long time because you have to wait for those politicians, as we have done in the United States when it comes to federal decisions. So I'm going to throw it over to Brendan Mitchell-Cheeseborough, who's been looking at your questions as they've come in. And Brendan, could you help us out with the most interesting, exciting, or hopefully easy, not difficult questions?
Definitely. Thank you so much, Roy. Thank you, Michael. So first, to start out, I think we could backtrack a little bit and talk about Oklahoma. Obviously, a lot of interest in that today. And Michael, are we expecting to see the medical market in Oklahoma see further declines before adult use passes? And what's, in your mind, driving these declines that we've seen so far?
Well, we'll know today whether adult use passes. We began to see what looked like it was a decline in the medical market in Oklahoma in mid last year. We started seeing patients trending down. We started seeing sales actually coming down. So Oklahoma actually lost some patients, lost some sales, which is the first time we've seen that happen in a medical market in advance of adult use. Same with Maryland, same with Pennsylvania. If adult use passes, I expect we'd see a more steep impact on medical in the near term, even before the regulations are put in place. If it fails to pass, it could go either way. Oklahoma is a difficult market. There's some 10%, I think, of its population has signed up to be patients, and it's a tough business climate for people. They've been very liberal with their licensing, very low barrier to entry, and that means a whole lot of licensed businesses, a whole lot of product, and really rapidly declining prices, which is, putting a lot of people out of business. But the interest in cannabis from consumers is there, obviously, and from Oklahomans, obviously, but also probably from border states, right? Oklahoma is surrounded by a few states which don't have quite as liberal a situation. So we expect that cross-border trade is significant in Oklahoma. Those things aren't likely to change without actual regulation in those states. So we could see medical begin to firm up a little bit. But again, it's a new situation in that medical has declined before adult use came around.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of good points there. Really unique situation we have in the Oklahoma market. Just moving forward, I wanted to remind everybody that you can add more questions in the questions drop down or the GoToWebinar panel. So get them in there, and we'll hope to get to as many of these as we can. Good question coming in from Chris in Germany about our prediction in the case of pre-roll share growth internationally and in US markets. I'm not sure if we have category forecast internationally, but we definitely have US. So Michael, what are we expecting to see as far as pre-roll growth? And have we seen the category share sort of overall looking at the aggregate of US markets sort of stabilize, or are we expecting to see more shifts within this forecast period that we're talking about?
Well, we know in detail in category in our 14 tracked markets, plus some that we see that we don't publish yet, and in Canada, and our forecast only covers the US and Canada. What we're seeing is relatively stable category now in Canada as we, new products were introduced in 2020, and those have begun to stabilize. In the US, it varies by state. Obviously, medical markets have a very different kind of look than adult use. We've seen that category share shift over time, but it's relatively stable. Like if we were to get data on a new market, look at it in detail, we'd probably see something pretty similar to what we're seeing in aggregate from our RSC tracking states. And that hasn't changed a lot. During immediately following the EVALI issue surrounding vapes, if you don't remember, a number of people died and suspicion was cast on vapes. Although the culprit was mostly illegal vapes, we saw vape share take a little bit of a dive and flower begin to grow. That was exacerbated a little bit during the pandemic, where we had a situation with cannabis being declared an essential service. So there was very little closure going on. People were at home more, and apparently were more willing to or more able to consume flower. Whereas when we look at our consumer insights data on vapes, we see that people say that vapes are, I like them because they're discreet, they're portable, they're compact, etc. Those factors became less of an issue, especially following EVALI during the pandemic when people were at home. As closures have, as states have opened back up, people have returned to the office, we've seen flower share decrease again, and we've seen vape share increase a little bit. Most other categories are fairly stable. Within some of those categories, we see changes. We don't forecast these in the forecast, but we see, for instance, candy is continuing growing share of the edibles category. Beverages pretty flat. Within our flower or inhalables category, we see pre-roll growing some. That's the influence of infused pre-roll and some premium, I think. So that's a general issue. We don't know internationally. We really don't have any visibility into category beyond the US and Canada.
Okay, so sort of just to backtrack onto the pre-roll point, we're expecting pre-rolls to hold, I think it's 12 to 15% in most markets. So across the aggregate, would you say that's about accurate?
They've shown a tendency to outperform other market categories, not massively, but yeah, quite often markets have started off with only about 5% pre-roll, and they're working their way up to that 15% mark. And I think that seems to be about where stability is establishing itself.
Cool.
I see that Chris is in Germany, works for a pre-roll or a filter company, so I'm sure he's extremely interested in what will happen in the German market.
Yeah, sort of to piggyback off of that, Michael, what do we sort of assess as the big risks in Germany in their route to adult use? Risks, barriers, anything that sort of could, throw a monkey wrench into the works?
Michael, you're muted, I think.
I'm sorry, yeah, I just muted instead of unmuting. Primarily political, I think, and of course we can't assess all of those factors, but the basic plan is to get an EU stamp on it, which will make it more palatable to national regulators. But my understanding is that national regulators have been applying considerable pressure to get it done. Again, I'm sure that Chris has a better, more on the ground understanding even of this, but I think that There definitely seems to be a will. Whether it will happen or not, we can't 100% say, of course. There are a lot of people, kind of watching this to see what will happen. I know that there are a number of other EU nations that, if the EU flipped the switch, would be likely to say, okay, well, now we can do what we want. But I think there's and I don't even understand all the EU issues, but if Germany does it on their own, then other nations could complain, et cetera. So there could be legal challenges. There could just be not enough will to get it done. A lot of factors could play into that. So while we have it on 2024, we're perfectly prepared to watch the situation and continually assess the situation, just as we do with any state or country that we have going legal.
I think the real concern is, given the other priorities, the other things that are going on in Europe, Germany is not likely to give up negotiating points with its partners in the EU for the sake of progressing the cannabis legalization. So it's the usual thing, you get caught up with the other macro political and economic factors in the markets.
And we have that issue in the US, of course, with our own national level legalization, which we didn't really address, but maybe I should take just a second, in that we don't expect to see significant national progress. It's not just going to be federal government flips a switch, says, okay, everybody can sell cannabis and transport it. We're probably going to see that come in a piecemeal fashion, maybe with the Banking Act, maybe with some IRS 280E relief, maybe with some of those other things that would be nice to have, so that cannabis businesses can operate sort of on the same footing as any other business. But again, priorities tend to push that back sometimes.
Definitely. Good question from Clifford here. What are we expecting to happen to the concentrate market? So I can sort of field this one a little bit, Michael.
Please do.
As far as concentrates, we've seen a trend that Michael spoke to with reference to the e-cigarette vaping associated lung injury crisis, EVALI. Vapes did take a pretty big hit for a couple quarters there. Then they've pretty much rebounded, and we've seen them sort of level out at about 20 to 25% of total dollar sales in most legal markets that we have this visibility into. So, out to the end of the forecast period, I think looking at the total concentrate market, we're expecting most markets to hold about a 30% share, with concentrates holding about a 30% share of total dollar sales in most markets, with most of that coming from vapes. So a lot of markets we're seeing, of that 30%, 2/3 will be vapes and the other 10% will be dabbables, but there are market to market differences there.
I just want to mention to anybody, all the people who are still with us, that of course, if you subscribe to our market forecast service, you get to see state, country, province, by category, all of our forecasting information, so you can dive in and get into a lot of detail there. Do go to bdsa.com or contact your BDSA rep should you be interested in additional detail.
All right, thank you, Roy. I guess we got time for one or two more. So we talked a bit about Germany and the size of the opportunity there and what we see as the probable route to market and any potential barriers there. We got a good question about Mexico. We're expecting Mexico to be one of the biggest markets out to 2027. Similar to Germany, I know a big piece of this is just because of the population they have and the political will pushing towards legalization, but we got some people wondering if you can expand a little bit more on that, Michael.
Well, Mexico for a few years has been trying to get very formalized medical regulations in place, and more recently to get adult use through. We've seen a lot of delays, a lot of court issues with that, and nothing actually been implemented. At one point, I think we were forecasting them to begin in 2023. And we've pushed that out to 2024. So it is another one of these where we're trying to keep our eye on the ball situation. It's also, Mexico has its own politics, its own issues, its own forces at things. We're currently, just based on what we can learn, we're assuming that that sales are going to start in 2024, and that we'll start to see some expanded medical activity there. Again, if regulations fail to fall into place, there's, you know, it's not going to happen. So.
Brendan, I noticed there are a couple of questions with regard to the chart of equivalent ARP growth versus sales. Maybe you could just pop that up, because I think there might be some misunderstanding about what that chart is. Just to be clear, the axes are growth, or in fact decline, because everything is below zero in average retail price on the left axis, and on the bottom axis we're talking about the percentage change in sales in dollar terms. A few questions seem to be asking us, is this price versus unit? No, it's the total dollar term. So I think there was a question about Florida, for example, and that would address that question. And I see we have another question that came in on the same theme. I think it's a rather fascinating chart, a lot to make from that. Back to you, Brendan.
All right. We got time for a few more questions, so if anybody has any other ones, feel free to get them in. 5-year growth for edibles from Clifford. Edibles is an interesting one. I think most markets now do allow most edible form factors, but there's still a couple of sizable medical markets that have limited edible form factors. Pennsylvania comes to mind. I think they're limited to tinctures and pills currently, if I'm correct there, Michael. But yeah, so out to 2027, we are expecting some major shifts in those kind of markets. As Pennsylvania and other markets like that move closer to adult use, it's really likely that they're going to be liberalizing some of the rules in their medical programs, and that's going to be changing the edible share. And markets as big as Pennsylvania will have a slight impact on total US edible share, but not expecting a huge swing on that whatsoever. Another one from John Watson. Outside of Germany, which are the most anticipated exciting markets to learn about in Europe, Oceania, and Latin America? I do think if I recall correctly, it's mostly Germany and Mexico that we're expecting to be the big contributors for international sales. There's a few other ones that I remember.
Well, Brendan,
go ahead.
Could I break in? I think too, one thing to consider here is that we're not necessarily forecasting adult use to happen in a lot of markets. Movement toward adult use in any given market could, of course, make it look much bigger. I think if we look at medical only in Oceania, probably Australia and New Zealand seem to be making some moves to improve things. I think that we may see some activity in Asia that could be interesting, although I think that's probably still up in the air. We've probably Israel talking about adult use, although we've not seen regulations there materialize and we haven't forecasted, but their medical market seems to be doing pretty well. You mentioned France, obviously a big nation. Spain, things are a little bit up in the air and kind of province or state by state there.
I think a lot of smaller European countries are sitting on the sidelines waiting to see what happens with Germany.
Yes, and we have, a town, for instance, that is full adult use, but the rest of the nation is waiting a couple years to see what happens. We have, the Netherlands, which is very high tourism and a very free cannabis attitude, and yet hasn't really, after many tests of adult use cultivation, et cetera, trying to legitimize the market that is there. We haven't seen a lot of movement there, but any number of these markets, again, maybe triggered by Germany, could go adult use and make them, sort of much more interesting. But of course, if you're a provider to a medical market, again, some of those medical markets I mentioned are interesting currently.
Yeah, those are all good considerations. I think it's good to sort of ground talks about Europe and, Germany sort of being the test case, and a lot of other countries probably looking to follow that.
A lot of frustration for people who made significant investments over the last few years. Spain is an interesting one where you would have expected by now that there would be a substantial market. My son just spent a semester abroad over there, and of course, and he is over 21, so cannabis consumption is everywhere, but very little of it is in the regulated market.
Yeah.
Right. Right, a lot of cannabis clubs and things like that, and I think we see that in a number of places, really.
Yeah, sort of going with the legal forbearance model that was common in U.S. medical markets for a long time.
Yeah, the Dutch model. Yeah. What else we got, Brendan? Make it a couple of easy ones if we have them.
I think we covered a lot of these. Question from Tom, going back to the price versus unit slide, what is the national picture on unit sales versus the 2% growth in revenue with prices falling? So do we have a quick summary for that, Michael, or is that getting a little bit too in the weeds?
That's a little too in the weeds for our model, in that we have detailed behind the scenes models for all these markets where we track, but we don't try to model that units price thing in markets where we don't have any information about it. We do have assumptions about what pricing is doing in a given market. For instance, we don't see the internals of Oklahoma, well, we do a little bit, but so we don't have detailed modeling at a nationwide level that I could speak to that.
I think what is very clear is that the large majority of the reductions in the major markets was driven by price. Unit volume had sort of maintained more or less stable last year. It was really price reductions that caused the overall. And in fact, in some of those markets where there was a decline, there was an increase in unit sales.
Yeah,
it's just that the price was getting pretty low.
Well,
I think that's probably about it, is it, gentlemen? Should we call it a day? Thanks very much, everybody, for your questions, for your attention, for paying attention to BDSA, and we're delighted to interact with you. I see there are a lot more questions coming in, but I think it's probably time for us to wrap. Everyone's got to get back to work, if this wasn't work. All the very best. Thanks everyone, and don't hesitate to reach out, bdsa.com, and of course reach out to your rep if you have one. Thank you.